The teller's name was Marcus, and I'd watched him grow up behind that counter, more or less. 9 years at the Cedar Falls branch of Heartland Trust, and in that time he'd gone from a nervous kid who double-checked every signature to a steady young man who called me Mr. Reeves, with the kind of respect you don't teach, you just recognize when you see it. He'd asked about my son's basketball season for 2 straight years before he found out I didn't have a son, I had a daughter, and he'd never once made me feel foolish for the assumption he'd carried. That's the kind of place it was, small enough that people remembered things about you. On a Tuesday morning in November, I walked into that branch on Main Street in Cedar Falls, Iowa, a little after 9, and asked to withdraw $4,000 from my checking account to cover a roof repair I'd been putting off since the summer hailstorm. Marcus smiled the way he always did. He asked for my ID. I handed it to him. He typed my account number into his terminal, and I watched something happen to his face that I want to describe carefully, because I've thought about it 100 times since. It wasn't confusion. Confusion looks like a furrowed brow, a tilted head. This was stillness. The particular stillness of a young man realizing he is about to say something to an old man that no young man wants to say. He said, "Mr. Reeves, can you give me just a second?" He picked up his desk phone. He turned his body a quarter turn away from me, which is a thing people do without realizing it, an instinct to create privacy in a room that has none. I couldn't hear the words, just the low current of his voice, urgent and careful at the same time. He hung up. He looked back at me and said, "Someone's going to come talk with you in just a moment, if that's all right." I said, "Marcus, what's going on?" He said, "I think it's better if Mrs. Delgado explains. She's the branch manager. I'm sorry, Mr. Reeves, just give us 1 second." He'd said my name twice inside of a minute. I know that trick because I used it myself. For 31 years, as a claims adjuster for a regional insurance company, the exact tone you use on a person right before you tell them something they aren't going to like. You say their name to remind them they're a person, and not just a policy number, right before the number becomes the only thing that matters. I delivered that tone to hundreds of families over 3 decades. I recognized it instantly coming back at me. I stepped aside and waited by the little roped-off line, and the bank went on being a bank around me. A woman in scrubs, depositing a check on her way to a shift. 2 teenagers arguing quietly over a canceled debit card. The ordinary hum of a Tuesday morning that had nothing to do with me, except that it did. A door opened. A woman in her 50s came out, silver-streaked hair pulled back, reading glasses pushed up on her head, moving toward me with the particular walk of someone who has rehearsed a sentence in the hallway and is now going to say it out loud for the first time. She said, "Mr. Reeves, I'm Anita Delgado, branch manager. Would you mind stepping back to my office?" I said, "Of course." Her office had a window that looked out on the parking lot and a monitor angled just slightly toward the empty chair across from her desk, the way furniture gets arranged when a room has hosted this exact conversation before. She sat. She turned the monitor another few degrees toward me, and I understood she was deciding, in real time, how much to show me and how fast. She said, "Mr. Reeves, before I tell you what happened, I want you to see something." She clicked her mouse. At 8:14 this morning, someone came into this branch and withdrew the full balance of your checking account. $18,190 in cash. She let that number sit in the room for a second before she went on. The withdrawal slip had a signature on it that was made to look like yours. Our fraud detection flagged the transaction almost immediately because of the amount, and I pulled the security footage before I called you back here. She clicked again, and the monitor filled with a grainy overhead shot, time-stamped 8 hours, 14 minutes, and 7 seconds of the teller window. A man stood there, average build, ball cap pulled low, but not so low that I couldn't see enough of the jaw. The way he stood with his weight shifted onto one hip, a habit I'd watched for 30 years across 1,000 family dinners. I said, very quietly, "That's my son-in-law. That's Curtis." Anita Delgado didn't say anything right away. She let me sit with it the way you let a man sit with anything that changes the shape of a room. I said, "He's not on that account. Never has been." She said, "No, sir, he's not. The account is solely in your name, which means what we're looking at is forgery, and we've placed a fraud hold on the funds pending investigation, which means they haven't cleared. Right now, that money is frozen. It exists, but nobody can move it or spend it while the hold is active. Frozen. I turned that word over the way I used to turn over a claim file that didn't add up, looking for the seam where the story stopped matching the facts. I said, "Anita, I need to ask you something plainly. Is the money still, in some form, recoverable?" She said, "The cash is gone from the branch, physically, but the hold means it can't be deposited or transferred anywhere without triggering another flag. If you file a police report today, which I strongly recommend, that starts the formal fraud recovery process with our investigations team." I said, "I'll need copies, the withdrawal slip, the transaction record, a still from that camera." She said, "I can have that ready within the hour." I said, "Thank you, Anita." I sat back in that chair a moment longer than I needed to, looking at the frozen image of my daughter's husband standing at a counter I'd walked up to 1,000 times, taking money he had no right to touch. And here's the thing that Curtis Delacroix did not know. Standing at that window at 14 minutes past 8 that morning, cap pulled low, believing himself clever. He did not know that 4 weeks earlier, I had moved every dollar of my real savings out of that account and into a place he would never think to look. What he'd just stolen was $18,000. I had deliberately left behind, like a fisherman leaves bait on a hook he's already set, because I had known he was coming for it. I'd known for a month, and I had spent that month getting ready for exactly this Tuesday morning. My name is Walter Reeves. I'm 68 years old. I live outside Cedar Falls, Iowa, on 11 acres my late wife and I bought the year our daughter was born, and the education that put me in Anita Delgado's office that morning cost me $18,000 frozen dollars and 31 years of professional habit, and the specific, unsentimental clarity of a man who spent his career reading claim files that other people were hoping he wouldn't look at too closely. My son-in-law made the same mistake every person who's ever tried to steal from a claims adjuster eventually makes. He assumed that because I was old and quiet and grieving, I wasn't paying attention. I am always paying attention. I spent 31 years working claims for Midwest Farmers Mutual, out of an office on Commercial Street that never had my name on the door but might as well have, given how many years I spent in it. I started as a field adjuster, the kind who drives out to a barn fire at 6 in the morning and has to look a farmer in the eye and tell him what his policy will and won't cover, and I finished as a senior claims examiner reviewing the files nobody else wanted, the ones where something in the paperwork didn't sit right and somebody had to figure out why. People think insurance is a cold business. It isn't. It's a business built entirely on believing people and knowing, with a kind of trained instinct you can't fake, the specific texture of a story that's been arranged rather than lived. My wife, Carol, used to say I married her the way I approved a claim, slowly, and only after I'd checked everything twice. She said it fondly. She was usually right about things she said fondly. Carol Ann Reeves, born Carol Ann Whitfield in Waterloo, Iowa, taught 3rd grade for 29 years at Lincoln Elementary, and she brought to that classroom the same patience she brought to our marriage and our daughter and the half-acre garden she kept along the south side of the property. Rows of tomatoes and squash and dahlias, she started from seed every March in little trays on the kitchen windowsill. She kept a spiral notebook for that garden, dated entries going back 15 years, what she'd planted and when the frost came, and which years the deer got past the fence. Carol died of a stroke in September, 14 months ago now. She'd been fine on a Thursday and gone by Friday morning, and there is a particular kind of grief that comes with that speed, the way it doesn't let you rehearse for it at all. I'm not going to describe those first weeks. They're mine. What I will say is that Carol died in September, and by early November, which is to say about 6 weeks later, my daughter Denise had asked me 3 separate times how my estate paperwork was arranged. I have 2 children. My son, Gary, is 41 and lives 2 hours away in Des Moines, where he manages a hardware store and calls me every Sunday afternoon without fail, and drove up twice in October just to sit with me on the porch and not talk about anything in particular. He has his mother's patience. He also told me, twice, quietly, without making an accusation of it, that he thought I should keep a close eye on Denise and Curtis, and that something about the way they talked to me since the funeral didn't sit right with him. I heard him say it. I didn't move fast enough on what I heard. My daughter, Denise, is 39. She married Curtis Delacroix 9 years ago, and Curtis works in used car financing at a dealership off Highway 20, The kind of job where a man learns exactly how much friendliness a person requires before they'll sign something, and applies precisely that amount and not a fraction more. He remembered my birthday. He asked about my knee. He'd never, in 9 years, said one unrehearsed thing to me at a holiday table. Denise is my daughter, and I love her the way you love a child who became a person that's harder to be around than you hoped she'd be, intelligent in a direction I'd noticed for years and refused to name out loud, because Carol always said Denise would come into her own eventually, and I'd deferred to Carol's read on people, the way I deferred to her on most things that weren't numbers. Carol was gone, and 6 weeks later Denise started asking about the will. The questions came dressed correctly. She said she'd read an article about parents who die without updating their estate plans and the mess it leaves behind. She mentioned that Curtis had seen a lot of financing paperwork at the dealership and would be glad to look anything over if it would help me. She wondered once, almost offhand, what the 11 acres were worth now, given how much land prices had climbed since Carol and I bought the place. The land. What the land was worth. I wrote every one of those conversations down in the little spiral notebook I've kept for work matters since 1994, dated and summarized, because that's not a habit I turn off just because I retired. It's not a habit, it's who I am. By December, Denise was asking about my online banking. She said she worried about me managing it alone with Carol gone. She said Curtis had helped set up bill pay for his own mother, and it had simplified everything for her. She offered to configure it for me, if I'd just give her my login. I told her I'd been banking online without help for 6 years and felt confident continuing to do so. She said she only wanted to help. I said I appreciated that. I wrote it down. In February, I came back from the feed store to find Denise in my den. She had a reason ready. She was looking for a photo album she thought Carol had kept in the closet in there. That was plausible enough. Carol kept boxes everywhere. But when I walked in, Denise wasn't at the closet. She was at my desk, and she closed my laptop a half second before I fully registered it had been open. I didn't say anything that day. I wrote it down after she left, and I spent the following week going through my accounts with the same specific attention I used to bring to a claim file that didn't smell right. I checked everything. Every login, every statement, every access record. I found 2 things. The first was that my checking account had been logged into from an IP address that traced back to a house 2 miles from mine, Curtis and Denise's house, at 1:52 in the morning on a night in January. 4 minutes. No transactions made. Just someone looking around with my credentials. The second was a soft credit inquiry I hadn't authorized, a pre-approval check for a home equity line against my property, submitted through an online lender's portal in December. It hadn't gone anywhere, because I've kept a credit freeze on my file for years as a plain matter of caution, and the freeze had blocked it cold. But the inquiry was there. December, right when Denise was first bringing up the estate. I sat at my kitchen table a long while with those 2 facts in front of me. 31 years reviewing claims teaches you what a finding looks like. It teaches you what it means when a pattern in the paper stops matching the story a person is telling you out loud. I'd been carrying a suspicion around for weeks, filing it in the part of my mind where you keep things you aren't ready to call by their real name. Sitting at that table, I was ready. The next morning, I called an attorney named Priya Anand, who practiced elder law and estate litigation out of a small office above a dry cleaner on West 4th Street, which I mention because the space above and below a law office tells you what kind of practice it is, and this one wasn't fancy. It was solid. There's a difference, and I've always trusted the solid kind more than the fancy kind. A retired colleague from Midwest Farmers had sent 2 people her way over the years and described her in the specific language one professional uses about another as somebody who reads everything twice and doesn't like surprises. Neither do I. I walked into her office on a Monday at 9 sharp with my spiral notebook, a printed summary of the 2 findings, and a copy of my will, drafted back in 2016 and untouched since Carol died. Priya read through everything without comment, the way the good ones do, completely and without performing a reaction for your benefit. When she finished, she set it down and looked at me steady. She said, "Mr. Reeves, I want to ask you something directly. Based on what you've documented here, do you believe your son-in-law is planning to take money from you?" I said, "I believe he's already started. The account login and the credit inquiry aren't coincidence. That's reconnaissance." She said, "And your daughter? Is she involved? Or is this him? I said, I don't know that yet. That's the part I haven't been able to settle in my own head. She said, what outcome do you want? I said, I want what's mine to end up where I decide it ends up. I want it on the record, clean and undeniable, because I spent 31 years learning that the record is the only thing that survives an argument. And I want to know for certain whether my daughter is the one holding the knife or whether somebody put it in her hand. Priya looked at me a moment. She said, those are things we can build toward. Let's talk about how. What she recommended, and what I carried out over the following month with the speed that 3 decades of claims work makes second nature, was this. I dissolved the joint designations that still had Carol listed on 2 of my accounts. I set up a revocable trust, the Walter J. Reeves Family Trust, naming Gary as successor trustee and primary beneficiary. I moved the 11 acres and the house into that trust. I opened a new account at a credit union across town, one Denise had never once mentioned or asked about, and moved the bulk of my actual savings there. I left my checking account at Heartland Trust open, and I left $18,190 sitting in it, because I understood, with the same cold clarity I'd once brought to a suspicious fire claim, that whoever had my login was watching that number. If I closed the account or drained it, they'd know something had shifted, and they'd go quiet, and I'd lose my chance to see the whole shape of what was happening. If I left it sitting there looking exactly like my ordinary operating funds, sooner or later somebody was going to reach for it. I also called Heartland Trust directly and asked to speak with someone in fraud prevention. I was connected to a woman named Denise Halloway, a different Denise, and the coincidence of the name unsettled me more than it should have, who worked in the bank's compliance office. I told her what I'd found and what I expected to happen. I gave her the account number and asked her to flag it for enhanced monitoring and to call me the instant anything unusual came through. She said, Mr. Reeves, in my career, I've had maybe 4 calls like this one. I asked how those had gone. She said, well, for the people who called. 4 weeks after that, on a Tuesday morning, I drove into town for what looked like a routine withdrawal, and Marcus went still behind his window. I filed the police report that same afternoon at the Cedar Falls station on Franklin Street. The officer, a young man named Osei, wrote it all down carefully and told me that given the dollar amount and the strength of what I had, it would go to their financial crimes unit. He took the security still, the forged withdrawal slip, and the full transaction record. The detective assigned was a woman named Renata Kowalski, mid-40s, sharp and unhurried, who called me 2 days later and asked me to come in with everything. I brought everything. The spiral notebook with 8 months of dated entries. The bank's written confirmation of the January login and its location. The credit report showing the blocked December inquiry. A separate timeline I'd built over a weekend, cross-referencing every estate-related conversation with Denise against my own calendar, month by month, dated and sourced. Detective Kowalski looked at that timeline for a long time before she said anything. She said, "You put this together yourself." I said, "I spent 31 years documenting things for a living. It doesn't turn off because I retired." She said, "You have the bank confirmation on the January login. The IP traces to a residential address." I said, "Yes, 2 miles from my property. I'll let you determine whose address that is." She was quiet a second. She said, "Mr. Reeves, between the footage, the forged signature, the credit inquiry, and this timeline, you've built about as complete a case as I've seen walk through that door." I said, "That was the intention." She said, "Why didn't you come to us back in January, when you first found the login?" I said, "Because in January I had an oddity. A 4-minute login at 2 in the morning isn't a case. It's a question mark. A case is what I had this month, with the footage and the forged slip and the whole shape of it laid end to end. I needed the whole shape before I moved." She said, "And now you have it." I said, "Now I do." She said, "One more thing. The man on the camera, have you confirmed that's your son-in-law and not someone else wearing his build?" I said, "I raised his wife. I've watched that man stand at 100 family dinners. I know how he carries his weight when he thinks nobody's studying him. That's Curtis." She nodded like that answer satisfied something in her own notes. She said, "We'll open it formally. I'll be in touch within the week." I called Gary from the parking lot outside the station. He picked up on the second ring. I told him everything, in order: the bank, the teller, the footage, the police report, the month of preparation before it. He was quiet the way he gets quiet when he's actually listening, instead of waiting for his turn to talk. When I finished, he said, "Dad, how long have you known?" I said, "I've been building toward this since February. I didn't want to bring you into it until I had it confirmed, because I didn't want you carrying something you couldn't do anything about yet." He was quiet another second. Then he said, "Is it Curtis, or is it both of them?" I said, "That's the part I still don't know. That's the part that scares me more than the money does." He said, "Do you want me to come up?" I said, "Not yet. There'll be a point where I need you here, and I'll tell you when it comes." He said, "Okay." For what it's worth, Mom saw something in Curtis a long time ago. She never said it outright, but I think she saw it. I said, "I know. She was always faster than me on people. I've spent my whole life better with numbers than with faces." He said, "You got there, though." I said, "I did." I drove home out past the edge of town, onto the gravel road that leads to our 11 acres, and I sat on the back steps that afternoon and looked at Carol's garden, which had gone ragged the way a garden goes ragged when the person who understood it isn't there to keep after it. The bones of it were still visible, the raised beds, the fence line she'd put up herself, but the specific intention behind it all was blurring at the edges, and I didn't have the knowledge to hold it together. I thought about her spiral notebook, still sitting in the mudroom where she'd left it. I went and got it. I sat back down and read through 15 years of her handwriting in the November light, following one season into the next. And for the first time I understood, with real precision, what she'd been growing out there and why, and what each bed actually needed to survive a winter. The investigation ran 9 weeks. Detective Kowalski called me twice more, and I met once with an assistant prosecutor named Michael Voss, careful and thorough, who reviewed my documentation with the kind of attention it had cost me a month to earn. What they eventually established was this: Curtis had accessed my banking credentials in January using a password he'd watched me type once at a Thanksgiving dinner 2 years earlier and simply never forgotten, a detail that turned my stomach more than almost anything else in the whole affair. He'd used those credentials to monitor my balance for months. He'd submitted the December home equity inquiry, which my freeze had stopped cold. He'd forged my signature on the November withdrawal slip and walked it up to Marcus's window himself, in a cap he apparently believed made him unrecognizable to a man who'd watched him hold that same posture at 100 dinner tables. The forensic pull on his phone, under a warrant Detective Kowalski obtained in December, turned up a notes app with months of tracked entries, my account balance, week over week, and a final entry logged at 7:41 that Tuesday morning, 33 minutes before he walked into the branch. It read, "Balance still sitting at 18K, moving today, before he notices." He'd been watching that number for months. He picked a Tuesday because he believed I had no reason to check the account that day, no appointment, nothing on the calendar that would send me anywhere near a bank. He didn't know I'd written that exact appointment into my own calendar 4 weeks earlier. He didn't know I'd already spoken to Denise Holloway in compliance, or that the account was flagged, or that I'd already moved the money that actually mattered to a credit union he'd never thought to check. He'd spent months watching a number on a screen and walked into a building to take it, never once suspecting the building was already waiting for him. As for Denise, and this is the part I'd been bracing myself for since February, the digital record showed something I hadn't let myself hope for. Text threads between her and Curtis from October and November showed her asking him, more than once, where the money for the roof and the property taxes was supposed to come from, and him telling her not to worry about it, he had it handled. There was nothing in those messages showing she knew what handled meant. When Detective Kowalski sat her down and showed her the security footage, Denise's reaction, by the detective's account, was not the reaction of someone protecting a plan. It was the reaction of someone watching her marriage end in real time on a computer screen. Denise called me that same evening. I almost didn't answer. I'm glad I did. She was crying in a way I hadn't heard from her since she was young, and she said, "Dad, I swear to God I didn't know." I asked him where the money was coming from, and he told me to trust him. I sat with the phone against my ear a long time before I said anything. 31 years of reading files taught me the difference between a story that's been rehearsed and one that's falling apart in real time, as the person tells it. Hers was falling apart. I believed her. Curtis was charged in January with theft, forgery, and unauthorized computer access. He didn't fight it long. Facing the footage, the notes app, the forensic trail, and a wife who'd already given a full statement against him, he took a plea in March. Full restitution, 3 years of probation, and a permanent mark on a record that was going to follow him into every finance job he ever tried to get again. Denise filed for divorce the same month, before the plea even went through. I told Michael Voss I appreciated his work, and I meant it. The restitution came through in May, and I deposited it into the credit union account and wrote the date down in my notebook, the way I write everything down, and then I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and let myself feel that it was actually over, which is a different kind of stillness than sitting in the middle of something not yet finished. Gary drove up the weekend after the plea, and we sat on the back steps in the May evening while he tried to help me figure out what Carol had meant by a note in the margin of her garden book. Something about the peonies along the fence needing to be moved before they got too much shade. He remembered his mother telling him that peonies sulk for 2 years after you transplant them and then reward you for the rest of your life. We found the exact page later. She'd written it almost word for word. We talked about Denise and Curtis once that evening, for maybe 10 minutes. In the settled way, people talk about something that's resolved without being entirely healed. Gary asked how it had gotten that far without anyone stopping it sooner, and I told him I thought it came down to the same thing it always comes down to. Somebody believes the person they're taking from isn't paying close enough attention, and that belief feels so comfortable to them that the plan becomes real in their head before they've thought through what actually being watched looks like. He said, "He should have known better than to try that on you." I said, "He never really knew me at all. 9 years at my table, and he never once asked me a real question. A man who doesn't ask questions doesn't learn anything worth knowing." He said, "That's a very you way of putting it." I said, "It's the only way I've got. The garden is coming back. Not what Carol had it, not her precision, not her 15 years of knowing exactly what wanted shade and what wanted sun, but better than it was in the fall." I've been working through her notebook page by page, and I moved the peonies exactly where her margin note told me to, and I'm prepared to wait the 2 years she promised it would take. Denise comes out most Saturdays now, and we work the beds together and don't talk about Curtis at all, because there's nothing left to say about him that isn't already sitting in a courthouse file. She's rebuilding something with me that I think we'd both let go quiet for too long, long before Carol ever passed. I kept my own record through all of it, the way I've kept a record of everything for 31 years, not because I expected to need it, but because that's the only way I know how to move through the world, writing it down as it happens so that later, when it matters, the truth is already sitting there in my own handwriting, waiting to be believed.